Hello, my name is Colby Sharp. I am a fifth grade teacher in Jackson County, Michigan, and I'm so excited to be chatting with you right now. I am going to be talking with Megan E. Freeman, who is the author of this mind-blowing 2021 novel in verse. If you haven't read it, you're really missing out. And I promise you, this book will fly off the shelves in your classroom library, your school library, your home library. It is just one of the wildest stories that I have ever experienced. It reminded me so much of reading Hatchet for the first time as a 10-year-old, and we can get to that. But before we do, let's bring in Megan right now. Good evening, Megan. How are you?
Hey, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, thank you so much for writing the book that I needed as a 10-year-old. I wouldn't have gone 3 years without reading a book between Hatchet and eighth grade. So I read alone. Number one, your publicist deserves a raise because she has sent me more emails than I think I have ever gotten on one book. So She has been persistent. And then I read it and loved it. And she's like, you should talk to Megan. You should talk to Megan. I'm like, I will. I'm trying. I'm teaching in person and virtual, and it's wild. But I'm so glad that we can make it work. Thank you for finding time on such short notice.
Sure.
Your novel, your book blew me away. It's completely wild. And I just couldn't, it was just so, I just couldn't process, I just couldn't believe it was happening, but at the same time, it felt so real. Mm-hmm. And it was just awesome. So thank you for creating this amazing book. You and I talked a little bit before we got started. And yes, I am reading it aloud to my fifth graders. I'll tell you exactly where we are. We are on... Okay. She just went to the town on her bike and had the run-in with the dogs.
Yeah.
And we're frantically trying to finish it before spring break. So
do you have spring break next week?
We have one more week of school.
Okay.
One more week of school. So yeah, and it's funny because on my classroom, we each have like this little whiteboard sign, and it has our names on the top. And it says Mr. Sharp. And then I always say is reading and then the book title. Nice. And my kids make so much fun of me because it looks like I'm reading alone, because like I'm reading all by myself. So it's whatever book we're reading aloud as a class. So anytime anyone walks by, says, Mr. Sharp is reading alone. So I'm actually not reading alone. I am reading it with 20 amazing in-person fifth graders. So for the people who haven't heard about this novel, I think it released in January. Is that correct?
Yeah.
January. It's just been out for a little while. Can you tell the people what it's about?
Sure. So Alone is the story of a girl named Maddie, who is 12 in the beginning of the book. And she and her best friends decide that they want to have a secret sleepover. And the way they're going to do this is they're going to lie to their families. So Maddie tells her mom she's going to spend the night at her dad's house, and she tells her dad she's going to spend the night at her mom's house. But in fact, the plan is that they're all going to go together to her grandparents' empty apartment and have a sleepover that none of the adults will know anything about. At the last minute, Emma and Ashanti cannot come. And Maddie has to spend the night alone because she's already trapped in her lie. She can't very well go home and tell her parents, oh, I'm home, because they think she's with the other person. And during the night while Maddie is asleep, the entire town is evacuated and she is left behind. And when she wakes up the next morning, she discovers this empty town and a bunch of messages on her phone, and she can't reach anybody and she doesn't know what's happened. And the story unrolls from there, and she has to figure out how she's going to survive and what she's going to do to take care of herself. And she doesn't know when and if her family will ever be back. And on top of that, she's not sure if her parents even realize that she's been left behind, because they each think she's with the other person, and she doesn't know if they're in touch with each other. So lots of questions she has to deal with on top of trying to stay alive.
And you drop some hints early in the book, like how long she's going to be alone. You drop some hints of what's going on with like these military vehicles driving through. And I can't imagine what it would have been like reading it if we didn't know like how long she was going to be alone. So
Hmm.
I'm just so curious as a writer,
Yeah.
why you chose to tell us that? And
Hmm.
was that always the plan? And was it always the plan for her to be alone for as long as she was?
Yes. So it was always the plan for her to be alone for a number of years. It was not always the plan to have there's a poem in the it's a novel in verse. I don't even think I mentioned that, but it's a novel in verse. And there's a poem in the very beginning. It's the very first poem in the whole book that is actually a little bit of a prologue, and it's spoken in Maddie's voice, but she's already been there quite a long time. And then we go back into the beginning and we start the story from the beginning. So that prologue poem wasn't always there. I added that fairly late in the process because I wanted to help the reader have some kind of context for what kind of story am I getting myself into here, and where are we going to go with this. And so that poem, I hope, serves that purpose. And then as far as how long she was going to be there, I was originally inspired by the novel Island of the Blue Dolphins, the classic book by Scott Odell. And in that story, the main character is alone for 18 years.
Whew.
18 mind-blowing years in 40,000 words. So that was the inspiration that made me think about, wow, what would it be like for a kid to be left alone today I'm in Colorado, in contemporary Colorado, but it could just as easily be Michigan or anywhere else. But I knew that I didn't want to tell a story that would be 18 years long. And I didn't even know how I could. If the kid was in a contemporary setting, in an environment where he or she was comfortable, that was the other thing that intrigued me, because most survival stories that we read and that we know, the main character is dropped into some unfamiliar environment, like Brian in Hatchet, or My Side of the Mountain. He leaves, he runs away from home, and he makes his house in the woods. Whereas in Island of the Blue Dolphins, she's on her own island, and her tribe and her family all leave her, but she's left behind to survive in her own home. And so that's what was intriguing to me. What would it be like if you were left behind and had to survive, but you were already really comfortable in your environment? So that's where I was sort of going with the whole idea. And I figured I could get away with maybe 3 or 4 years, and that's what it ended up being. Spoiler alert, she's alone for about 3.5 years.
That's so long.
It is really long. It's really long when you start off and you're 12, right?
Yeah,
When you
because a
think
lot
about
happens between a
a lot
12-year-old
happens.
girl and a 16-year-old girl.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the parts that I loved was her kind of her realizing that she was alone, and like the cell phones ringing.
Hmm.
So it was just, that was like, whoa, and the power going out,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
all of that. Like, she's like alone. So she is, yeah. Those of you who haven't read it, she is alone in her house,
Hmm.
and her parents are divorced.
Hmm.
So she has two homes that she kind of goes back and forth with. And you
Hmm.
gave her a companion. Why
Yes.
did you do that?
I gave her a companion because I, again, inspired by Island of the Blue Dolphins, where the girl in that story tames the wild dogs on the island and befriends them. I really wanted Maddie to have some sort of company, some sort of comfort in another creature, but I knew it couldn't be a human. I thought about the possibility of having her find other people, and she sees other people, she doesn't interact with them. But I really wanted her to have someone she could talk to, and somebody who could inspire her, make her feel braver, give her some courage, potentially provide some protection for her. So I chose a Rottweiler because Rottweilers are big and sturdy and thick and strong, but they also have these wonderful eyebrows. Their faces are so sweet. And I like the idea of her inviting the dog up on the bed so that at night she could reach, snuggle up against him and feel his heat and his strength. And it gave her somebody to talk to. And he doesn't exactly talk back, but she still has a lot of conversations with him. So it seemed like a kind thing to do to a character who I was throwing so many incredibly difficult obstacles at.
So many, like
So many.
weather,
Right.
and fire, and these, all like the kitten scene.
I'm sorry about that.
My kids were so mad at you.
I
Like,
know.
that was so, like, you can do things to people, you can do things to children, but you can't, like what you did to that
I know.
kitten.
I know. I know. Okay, here's the thing.
Wow.
So I was talking to a class of fifth graders this morning, as a
Okay.
matter of fact, and that was their toughest question was like, okay, why does the kitten have to die? And here's the thing, I asked it right back to them. Why does the kitten have to die? Because it does. And there's a really good reason for it. And I tried really hard to do it without having the kitten die, but it has to die. And the reason it has to die is Maddie is spying on some looters who have come to town thinking the entire town is abandoned, and they are systematically going through the little business district, and they're stealing things that they can sell for scrap metal, or that they can, it's finding money that they can take, and they're looting the town because they know everyone's gone. And she sees them, and these are the first people she has seen in months. And imagine if you were alone by yourself and you heard human voices. My first instinct would be to run right to them and say, hey, oh my gosh, I've been here alone this whole time. Can you please help me? But Maddie is a little smarter than I am. And she thinks, I better check this out, because she doesn't know why the people left in the first place. She doesn't know what the problem was that caused the town to have to be evacuated. So she has to evaluate everything, thinking this could be threatening to me. It might not, but it could be. So she spies on these guys, and she's trying to figure out if these could be her rescuers. And they can't, you and I know they can't be her rescuers, because we want her to have to struggle to survive for 3 years. And it's only been a few months. So she had to see them do something that would be more frightening and more awful than the thought of letting them go and continuing to stay alone. So her situation and her story is filled with these kinds of dilemmas, where either choice I make, I may be making a terrible decision, and I don't know, and I won't know until I've made it. And she constantly has to weigh and evaluate the pros and the cons of every situation. And I knew for myself, if I was her and I was 12 or 13 and I was in that situation and I saw people for the first time and I was desperate to get back to my parents, they would have to be pretty creepy and pretty scary for me to choose not to reveal myself to them and to stay hidden. And that's why the kitten has to die. But I want the kids to figure that out. I want to ask them the same question and make them tell me why it has to be that way.
But a kitten. You
I know. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I know, it's awful.
I thought it was interesting to read in the shadow of the insurrection at the Capitol.
Yeah.
Because for me, I'm like, oh, this is like possible. Right. Like for me, it wasn't, I mean, I know you didn't plan that or by any means want that, but it was wild to read that when things in the government were in a way that seemed unbelievable to happen.
Right. Beyond our ability to comprehend that it could ever be anything but fiction.
Yeah.
Well, and honestly, that's how COVID has felt too. You know, when Simon & Schuster acquired this book, it was 2019. It was summer of 2019. And pandemics weren't on anyone's radar. I'm sure they were on the radar of the scientists who know what's possible, but they weren't on my radar. And so to have this book come out in the middle of a time when we are very, very viscerally experiencing social distancing and isolation, and so many people have been experiencing loneliness in ways they never have before, has been really profound and unfortunate. You know, I wish the pandemic had never happened, but there's an interesting conversation between the loneliness that Maddie experiences and the loneliness that we've all been experiencing as a global species.
Would you have done anything differently if you were her? Like, how would you have done alone? That's
a really interesting question. I probably would have run right out and introduced myself to the looters, and who knows if that would have been smart or not. I might also have tried a lot earlier in the book to drive a car. When I was 12, my dad had taught me how to drive secretly behind closed doors, and I really couldn't wait to drive. I was really excited. I wanted that independence and that power. So I probably would have tried driving somewhere to see if I could find other people. And I don't know that I would have had the foresight to think about the consequences if I ran out of gas in the middle of, you know, between here and Kansas, which eastern Colorado, there's a whole lot of nothing. And you could end up in a lot worse of a situation. So I probably would have made some hastier decisions. And I don't know that that would have served me very well.
I think that it's natural for kids. My kids are reading it, how they would have done things differently. They're like, Mr. Sharp, like lawnmower gas, like why isn't she looking for people's like red 5-gallon lawnmower gas? Like, doesn't she
Exactly.
know how to like siphon gas out of other vehicles? Like, no,
Exactly.
she doesn't.
Exactly.
She just wanted to have a sleepover with her friends. Like, you would have
Right.
even Googled this probably. Like, she did not know.
Right.
There's no Google.
Right. Right. But
So,
the kids come up with such great solutions and such great ideas. And I keep encouraging the kids I'm talking to write that scene, write that story, see where it would go. And that's one of the things that's fun about talking about this is the presentation that I do with the kids is called Could You Survive Alone? And we look at a lot of those different kinds of questions. So I think there's a lot of really rich fodder there for them to think through their own creative imaginations and what would they do in that situation.
As a Hatchet lover, I'm thinking, oh, Brian didn't have it that bad. Like, what was it? Just like a month or so? Like, come on.
Right. One season. He didn't even have to deal with weather very much. Right.
Like, that's the whole reason why Brian's Winter was written, because kids were so mad that he was rescued so soon that Gary had to write that one.
Right.
How did the book change a lot? Like, did you outline it?
Yeah.
Did you just write it from beginning to end? What was that like?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I actually wrote it the first time in prose. So it wasn't in verse at all. And I did outline to a certain extent. I knew that there was going to be a chronology. I had the advantage of setting it in Colorado where we have clear, distinct seasons. So I could, and holidays and birthdays, and I could think through the structure, sort of using that chronology as a guide. And the story was compelling. The story, I think, has always been compelling. It's got a hook that is hard to resist, but the writing wasn't up to par, and the narrative verse or the narrative prose didn't really didn't rise to the premise of the hook. And I've been a poet my whole life, and I was actually in a workshop with another author who was talking about her experience writing novels in verse, and it struck me that I needed to go back and rewrite it. So I rewrote the entire thing and I put it into verse, and that really helped me find the inner experience that Maddie has. It stopped being so much about the external adventure and the physical survival, and it brought in the layers of psychological and emotional challenge of loneliness and isolation. And so I think it really it made the story much more multidimensional and nuanced, and that made a huge difference.
So help me understand what makes a novel in verse good. Like, how do you name it? Because I love this book, and I loved Red, White, and Whole, and I love Jacqueline Woodson's Before the Ever After and Jason Reynolds' Long Way Down, and Inside Out and Back Again. But I don't really know why those books are so good. So, and I know that you are like an expert because I was watching your presentation at the Michigan Reading Association and could definitely nerd out about this topic. So what makes a novel in verse great? And how do you think an author decides to do that? Like, what would make an author decide to do that?
Well, first of all, what makes a novel in verse great and what makes a novel in prose great is the exact same thing, which is the story. And story has nothing to do with form. Story has to do with a human being in a situation where they're facing a challenge or an obstacle or a problem that they need to solve, and how they go about solving it and what that ultimate resolution is. And all good novels have that as their beginning, whether it's a verse novel or a prose novel or a graphic novel or any other kind of novel that we haven't been able to imagine yet. I think what's really wonderful and the potential in a novel in verse, and all those books that you mentioned are so exquisite. And of course, I always think of Kwame Alexander's book, The Crossover, which took everyone by surprise and by storm because it was so new and so fresh and so delicious. And I think the power in poetry, there's an invitation implicit in the poetry that isn't necessarily there in prose, or if it's there in prose, it's farther down in the layers. So in poetry and in a novel in verse, the author is expecting and relying on the reader to collaborate with them in very real ways. So if I'm writing in prose, I can write a long description of the room, or I can write a long description of the person's emotional response to something. If I'm writing in verse, I don't have very many words to work with. You know, Jason Reynolds of Long Way Down, he gave a great presentation over the summer to the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was essentially, you may look at a page in a novel in verse and see only 10 words on that page, but there are 10,000 words underneath. And I get goosebumps just remembering him saying that, because it's so true and it's so profound. But if that reader isn't willing to find those 10,000 words underneath, then it doesn't work. And at the same time, if the author doesn't give the reader the right 10 words, then the reader can't find those words because they don't have enough. So there's this wonderful collaborative back and forth interplay that happens between the reader and the author that I don't think is always necessarily there in the same way in prose. Now, having said that, prose novels are made up of paragraphs that combine to make chapters, and the chapters combine to tell this narrative arc, right? The beginning, the middle, and the end. A novel in verse is exactly the same way, except that instead of paragraphs, we have poems. The other thing that novels in verse have that prose doesn't necessarily have is that it gives the author the opportunity to use titles. And one of the things I find is that especially for reluctant readers or English language learners, giving them those clues can be really, really instructive in helping create a context before they have to start to decode the text. So there's an opportunity for kids who might be overwhelmed by a big block of text, a block of prose on the page, to find their way into a story. Inside Out and Back Again is a beautiful example of that. And it's like looking in a mirror, in a mirror, in a mirror, because Teng Halai is writing about a girl who's learning to speak and read English. And so she's learning the language, and then we read the poems about her learning the language, and we learn more about the language through her experience. There's this wonderful interplay. So I think that there is an active agency that's required by a reader when they're reading novels in verse. But I also think there's a feeling of satisfaction, because my book is 406 pages long, but you can read it in an afternoon because there's so much white space on the page. You turn the pages much more quickly. So especially for reluctant readers, there's a feeling of satisfaction, of accomplishment that may not be as attainable with a more dense novel in prose.
So let's not pretend. I am a teacher and you are a teacher. How does one help kids that want to try this? And you don't have to like just teach me like a class, but like what resources could we use, or where would be a good place for us to start to help kids? Because I've read, at least this is my second novel in verse that I read aloud, and the kids just, and is it verse novel or novel in verse? Like, I don't,
it's both. It's either or both, depending on how much space you have left in your tweet.
Okay. So how do you, like, what would your tips be for educators or parents or people who are wanting to encourage young writers to try this type of writing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I would do is play with this notion of distillation. And when I was in the classroom, what I used to do was I'd assign every syllable a dollar amount. So depending on the age of your students and what kind of math you want them to do, you can decide what that is. But let's say that each syllable is worth $1. And you have a 3-syllable word, so that's a $3 word. And so have them count up the number of syllables that they have in a sentence or in a paragraph. And let's say it comes to $45. See if they can then distill that down to $25 and get them to start to revise and to edit and to pull words out. And of course, you don't want to lose the meaning, but they can also substitute words in, and they, individually monosyllabic words start to be worth less, but you can use more of them. And so you teach them how to distill their writing and get it down to its core and its essence, and then see if they need all those other words to begin with. And that can work in reverse too. If you have somebody who's writing really short, discrete sentences and you want them to expand it, then challenge them. Take that $15 sentence and see if you can get it up to $65. And you may or may not want them to follow the mechanics or the rules of writing. That completely depends on what they're doing. But you can play games with it that way that are really, really fun. Challenging them to think about and looking at Kwame Alexander's The Crossover is a great example, because he is so playful all over the page. He plays with the font, he plays with the size and capitalization and italics and the direction that the words are going in. You could challenge them to play with the white space on the page. Sharon Creech is really great for that too. Her book Moo, so playful, and the space and her relationship of the words to the space is really deliberate and really fun. So showing them those models and giving them examples of, here are some ways that different authors have played with it. How might you play with it? And getting them to ask those questions. Do I have all those words on the same line just because I automatically put them there? Or is that really where I want them? And do I have the end of the line where it is because it's the end of a sentence? Or is that really where I want it to end? Every choice in verse is absolutely deliberate. Whereas most choices in prose, at least initially, are muscle memory, because we always capitalize the first letter of a sentence. We always punctuate at the end of a sentence. We do it without thinking about it. So teaching them how to think about those things as options as opposed to a default can be really empowering as well. And I could go on, but I know that.
Well, and if you're watching and if you ever get a chance to see Megan present at a conference, she talks about all of those things that she just talked about. She presented recently at the Michigan Reading Association conference, and I've been going through her presentation, and she talked about Sharon Creech and Moo. She talked about Long Way Down and what Jason did. So always take an opportunity to see Megan talk about this stuff. It's so fun when you get a chance to see someone talk about something that they just love so much and are so passionate about. So I guess I don't want to keep you too long, but I do have a couple more things I want to talk about. How in the world did you become a writer?
Oh, well, I was really fortunate. When I was in 5th grade, the elementary school that I went to had a relationship with 2 poets, and the poets came into our classroom every single week for the entire school year. And they would give us prompts, and we would write poetry, and then they would take our poems, and our moms volunteered and would type up the poems, and then they'd bring them back the next week, and we'd read our poems out loud to each other, and the poets would circle things they were interested in or that they thought were particularly intriguing, and we would talk about why. And then we would write some more, and they would take them away and type them up and come back. And we did this for 3 years in my 5th, 6th, and 7th grade classes.
What?
And it was, here's the thing. If you want to make writers, you got to get them reading to each other, because when you read something to someone and they say, "Ooh, that's so cool. Ooh, I love that. That's so interesting." It makes the writer want to go back and write some more, because that feeling of connection is so powerful. It's so powerful. So the more we can get kids writing and writing freely and writing without worrying about that there's a right or a wrong way, and teaching them to play with words on the page. It's like improvising music. You can't do it wrong. You just might like one way better than another. The more they can do that, and the more they can share with one another, the better, and the more they'll want to write. And here's the thing that I learned in the classroom. They don't have to share everything they write with you. If you're a teacher and you're reading everything your students are writing, they are not writing nearly enough. No, and you, of course, have no life, because that's an impossible task. They can read and write to each other and share back and forth with each other, and it has the same purpose. They don't need your eyes on it for it to be filling that void and feeding that desire. So I think that's a big part of it.
That's so interesting to say that. Today was like a celebration day in our class. We had finished up some nonfiction writing. And in the COVID days, it's tricky and hard to share and to move around like we normally would. But we just uploaded all of their pieces to a Google folder. And then we just spent like an hour reading. And I gave them each a stack of Post-it notes. And I'm like, if you like something or learn something, and they just would like walk over and put Post-its. And the way that they lit up when their desks were covered in compliments and questions and curiosities. Yeah.
It's powerful. It's about that connection. Human beings want to connect with each other, and language gives us a way to connect that is completely unique and marvelous. And so we need to create those opportunities for kids to do that. And that's what my teachers did for me when I was in elementary school.
Because everything that we write isn't for an audience, but if you never have an audience, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Final question. What is your hope for this beautiful book?
Oh, well, my hope for this beautiful book is that the kids who read it will be so excited about books that they will put it down and pick up another one and keep reading. That is my dearest hope. I hope that for the reluctant readers, it turns them into enthusiastic readers, and that they find more books that they love. And for the enthusiastic readers, I hope that it continues to feed them and keep them satiated and keep them going. And eventually turn them into creative thinkers who will create their own art and have their own good time with language.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for this book. I wish you would have written it like 30 years ago, but it's okay. It would have been a much different book that wouldn't have had the cell phone scene and all of that. But
that's right. That's right.
It was, I love the cover, and I saw it. I'm like, oh, that looks really great. But like, just keeps popping up on Twitter and Instagram. People are talking about it, and there's a lot of buzz. And when I dug in, it was easy to see why. So you've created something special, and we are excited to finish it,
And
reading it with kids.
Let's shout out to Pascal Campion, who did this cover art, because it is really exquisite. And I feel so lucky because kids who might not be interested in the story necessarily pick it up because it is such a beautiful book, and I'm so grateful to him. He also did The Canyon's Edge, which is another survival novel in verse that has a beautiful cover. Dusty Bowling, yeah, exactly. So thank you, Pascal, wherever you are, for that great cover. Yeah, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, friends. Check it out. Alone, Megan E. Freeman. It is a novel, a verse novel, novel verse, whatever you want to call it. All I know is you will love it. I promise. Like, I know I say that a lot. This is the book that I would have read, and this is the book that I would have been obsessed with. I still have my Hatchet that I bought when I was 10 years old when we read aloud Gary Paulson's Hatchet. And I truly believe in my heart that this book alone will be that book for someone, many kids. This is going to be the book that you watch. You watch Megan Freeman in 25 years, a bunch of copies of this book are going to sell because all of the 10-year-olds today are going to buy it for their 8-year-olds because parents think that their kids are ready for books much younger than they were. So in 25 years, check the sales on this book alone because all of the kids reading it today are going to buy it then. It's so good.
I hope so.
It's so good. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you have an awesome-tastic day.
Thanks. Take care.